If you enjoy long, calm history storytelling, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. New videos every week about medieval warfare, daily life, power, and what history usually leaves out. What really happened after medieval wars ended? This video explores what came after the battles, when armies left, but pressure stayed. No heroes, no big speeches, just daily life under new rules, new demands, and quiet control. A long-form, immersive history video made for listening. When medieval wars ended, the sound of battle faded first. The shouting stopped. The clash of metal disappeared. The movement of armies slowed and then vanished from the horizon. For many people, this silence felt like relief, but relief was temporary. What followed was not peace. It was something far more demanding. After the fighting stopped, life did not return to what it had been before. It could not. Too much had changed. Land had been crossed by armies. Villages had been used, damaged, or emptied. Fields had been harvested early, trampled, or abandoned. Even where destruction was limited, the balance of power had shifted permanently. Medieval war did not end when armies withdrew. It ended only when control was secured. For the people who remained behind, the aftermath of war was defined by uncertainty. Authority was no longer clear. Old leaders might be gone or weakened. New rulers were not yet fully established. During this period, survival depended less on strength and more on caution. Knowing when to speak, knowing when to stay silent, knowing when to adapt. Soldiers often stayed behind after wars officially ended. They guarded roads, towns, and resources, not because fighting continued, but because outcomes needed to be enforced. A war that is not enforced can be reversed. Medieval rulers understood this well. Victory had to be maintained, not just declared. This meant that armed men became part of daily life even in times of supposed peace. Their presence changed how people behaved. Travel felt risky. Markets felt watched. Villages felt exposed. You did not need open violence to feel controlled. The memory of violence was enough. One of the first things people noticed after war was the change in demands. Taxes increased. Labor was required. Supplies were collected. These demands were often justified as necessary to rebuild or secure peace. But for ordinary people, they felt like the continuation of war by other means. A farmer who survived the fighting now faced new obligations. Grain was taken not by raiding armies, but by officials. Labor was demanded not by force in the field, but by decree. Refusal was no longer punished immediately, but it was remembered. This is where medieval war became heavier, not lighter. During battle, danger was immediate but brief. After war, pressure was constant. Every season carried expectations. Every harvest carried risk. Every interaction with authority required care. People learned that survival depended not on bravery, but on predictability. Villages that had once operated through shared customs now had to answer to distant authority. Decisions were no longer negotiated locally. Disputes were judged by new rules. Outcomes felt unfamiliar and often unfavorable. What had once been flexible became fixed. This transition created deep anxiety. People did not know which traditions still mattered, which rights were still recognized, which behaviors were now dangerous. Living through this uncertainty was exhausting. Families adjusted quickly. Parents taught children caution rather than confidence. Ambition felt risky. Stability felt safer. The goal was no longer to improve life, but to avoid attracting attention. Survival replaced progress as the primary concern. Movement became restricted in subtle ways. Roads were still open, but travel without reason invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny carried consequences. So people stayed closer to home. Communities became more isolated, not by law, but by fear. Markets continued, but they changed. Trade routes narrowed, prices shifted. Information traveled slowly. News was filtered carefully. Speaking too freely could be misunderstood. Silence became a form of protection. What made this period especially difficult was that it did not feel temporary. Unlike battles, which clearly end, the aftermath had no clear conclusion. People did not know how long these conditions would last. Months turned into years, years into generations. Over time, pressure became routine. This routine is what history often misses. The absence of dramatic events creates the illusion of peace. But peace without freedom is simply endurance. People lived, worked, married, and raised children under conditions shaped by war long after the fighting had stopped. The winners of medieval wars did not rely on constant violence to maintain control. They relied on memory, obligation, and structure. They allowed daily life to resume, but only under terms they defined. For ordinary people, this meant learning a new reality, one where the war was no longer visible, but never truly over. One where survival required obedience, caution, and acceptance of limits that had not existed before. The battlefield disappeared, the consequences did not. And this is why understanding medieval warfare requires more than studying battles. To understand its true impact, we must look at what followed, at how power settled into daily life, at how victory reshaped survival itself. Because for most people, medieval war was not something they experienced only once. It was something they lived with long after the fighting ended. When medieval wars ended, the victors did not disappear into history. They moved into place. Victory was not simply celebrated, it was organized. The winners of a medieval war understood that defeating an enemy was only the first step. The more difficult task was making sure that defeat lasted. For the population that found itself on the losing side, life under the winners began quietly. There were no mass announcements explaining what would change. There was no single moment where the new order was made clear. Instead, change arrived through presence, through new faces, through unfamiliar authority, through demands that felt small at first, but carried weight. The winners stayed close to the land they had taken. Garrisons were established. Officials were appointed. Representatives of power appeared in villages that had once governed themselves. These men did not arrive to negotiate. They arrived to observe, record, and enforce. For ordinary people, this presence was unsettling. You could no longer assume that your actions were invisible. Someone was always watching, or could arrive at any moment. Even when soldiers were not nearby, their authority was understood. That understanding shaped behavior more effectively than patrols ever could. One of the first changes people noticed was the shift in decision-making. Local leaders who had once resolved disputes lost influence. Some were removed. Others remained, but only as intermediaries. Real authority now came from elsewhere. Decisions could be overturned, judgments revised, customs ignored. This loss of local control affected everything: land use, labor obligations, justice. Even small disputes felt riskier because outcomes were no longer predictable. People learned quickly that challenging authority was not just dangerous, it was often pointless. The winners also controlled resources. Food supplies, animals, tools, and labor were redirected to serve the new power structure. What had once supported a community now supported an administration. This was rarely framed as exploitation. It was framed as necessity. Security had to be maintained, order had to be enforced, peace had to be protected. For those providing these resources, the distinction did not matter. What mattered was loss. Farmers found that a larger portion of their harvest was no longer theirs to decide. Labor was demanded at specific times, often disrupting planting or harvesting cycles. Failure to comply did not always bring immediate punishment, but it was remembered. Memory itself became a threat. Living under the winners required constant calculation. How much could you give without ruining your family? How visible could you afford to be? Which demands could be delayed and which could not? These calculations were exhausting but necessary. Movement became increasingly restricted in practice, even when no law explicitly forbade it. Traveling without reason attracted attention. Attention attracted questions. Questions could lead to obligation or suspicion. So people limited their movement voluntarily. Villages grew inward-facing. The world shrank. Markets continued, but under new oversight. Prices were influenced by demands from above. Trade routes adjusted to avoid scrutiny. Merchants learned which goods were safe to move and which attracted interest. Information traveled carefully. News was filtered not by censorship but by fear. Speech also changed. Complaints were softened. Criticism became indirect. Jokes became dangerous. People learned the difference between what could be said privately and what could never be said publicly. Silence was no longer just caution. It became a skill. Families adapted across generations. Children born after the war grew up knowing no alternative. For them, the winners were simply the rulers. Authority felt distant, firm, and permanent. The idea that life had once been different survived only in stories. Stories told quietly, without expectation that things could return to the past. This generational shift mattered deeply. The longer the winners ruled, the less visible the violence of conquest became. Control no longer required force. It required routine. Expectations were shaped early. Obedience became normal. For some, adaptation offered limited opportunity. Individuals who learned the language, customs, or methods of the new rulers could gain small advantages. But these opportunities were rare and uneven. Most people adapted not to improve their position, but to avoid worsening it. This is the quiet truth of life under the winners. It was not defined by constant brutality. It was defined by adjustment, by the steady narrowing of options, by learning where the boundaries were and never crossing them. From a distance, such societies appear stable. Fields were worked, taxes were collected, laws were enforced. But beneath that stability was a constant effort to remain acceptable, to remain unnoticed, to survive without provoking attention. The war had ended, but its outcome was enforced every day. And while life under the winners reshaped behavior, it also reshaped something deeper, the relationship between people and authority itself. To understand how medieval societies changed after war, we must look next at how obligation replaced violence, and how pressure was maintained without constant force. That transformation marked the true end of the battlefield, and the beginning of something far more lasting. As the noise of battle faded, a quieter system took its place. Medieval wars did not end with freedom for those who survived them. They ended with obligation. What had once been demanded by force in moments of crisis was now demanded regularly, predictably, and with authority that felt permanent. This transition mattered more than any single battle. On the battlefield, danger was immediate and visible. After the war, pressure became constant and invisible. People were no longer threatened by swords drawn in front of them. They were constrained by expectations that shaped every part of daily life. Obligation became the new weapon. One of the first obligations imposed after war was labor. Communities were required to rebuild roads, repair fortifications, and support garrisons. These demands were framed as necessary for peace and security. But for those performing the labor, they felt like the continuation of war under a different name. Time that had once been spent tending fields or caring for families was now redirected. Seasons mattered deeply in medieval life, and forced labor often arrived at the worst possible moments. Missing a planting or harvest window could mean hunger months later. Obligation did not need to kill immediately to be deadly. Delay alone was enough. Taxes followed closely behind. Not temporary wartime levies, but regular collections designed to sustain the new order. Grain, livestock, tools, and coin were taken systematically. What had once been emergency contributions became fixed expectations. Refusal was rare, not because it was impossible, but because the consequences were understood. Obligation worked because it relied on memory. People remembered what happened during the war. They remembered destruction, punishment, and loss. Those memories did the work of enforcement. Authority did not need to threaten constantly. Obligation carried its own weight. The psychological effect of this shift was profound. People no longer prepared for sudden danger. They prepared for endurance. Survival meant managing scarcity, not avoiding attack. Anxiety became quieter, but more persistent. Communities adjusted their internal rhythms to accommodate these demands. Decisions were made cautiously. Plans were conservative. Risk was avoided whenever possible. The goal was no longer advancement. It was stability. This stability, however, was fragile. One failed harvest, one excessive demand, one unexpected obligation could tip a family into crisis. Medieval life after war was defined by narrow margins. People lived close to their limits, and obligation narrowed those limits further. Obligation also changed how authority was perceived. Violence had been something external, an army arriving, an enemy attacking. Obligation came from within the system. It was delivered by officials, records, and schedules. Authority became abstract, less personal, harder to confront. This abstraction made resistance difficult. You could not argue with a calendar. You could not negotiate with a ledger. Obligation felt impersonal, even when it caused personal suffering, and impersonal systems are harder to challenge than individuals. Over time, people learned to measure their lives around these demands. They calculated how much they could give without collapse. They adjusted diets, reduced expectations, and postponed plans. Every decision became conservative by necessity. This slow erosion of choice is one of the least visible consequences of medieval war. Battles destroyed bodies, obligation reshaped lives. What made this system effective was its predictability. Violence is chaotic. Obligation is orderly. Once demands became routine, people organized their lives around them. Compliance became habitual. Resistance felt disruptive not just to authority, but to survival itself. Children grew up watching this behavior. They learned not from instruction, but from example. They saw parents calculate, compromise, and endure. Obligation became normal. The memory of freedom faded. From the outside, societies shaped by obligation appear calm. There are no constant uprisings, no visible terror. But calm does not mean justice. It often means exhaustion. And exhaustion was the true outcome of medieval war. As obligation replaced the battlefield, violence became less visible but more enduring. The war had not ended. It had been absorbed into daily life. And once absorbed, it shaped how people thought about authority, duty, and survival for generations. To understand the full cost of medieval war, we must look next at how these obligations were enforced, not through constant punishment, but through systems designed to remember, record, and repeat. Because once obligation is written down, it becomes very difficult to escape. Once obligation became routine, it needed to be remembered. Medieval power did not rely on constant punishment to function. It relied on memory, and eventually on records. What could be remembered could be enforced. What could be written down could be repeated. After wars ended, rulers understood that control required permanence. Armies moved, soldiers aged, commanders changed, but obligations needed to remain. To achieve this, medieval authorities turned increasingly to record-keeping, not as neutral administration, but as a tool of control. Land was measured, holdings were listed, taxes were calculated, labor duties were assigned specific values and schedules. These records transformed living communities into managed resources. Villages became units, families became entries, lives became obligations that could be tracked over time. For ordinary people, this was a profound change. Memory had once been shared and flexible. Custom could adapt, agreements could be renegotiated, but written records were rigid. Once something was recorded, it became difficult to dispute. Even if the record was wrong, it carried authority. This shifted power away from people and toward systems. Officials did not need to know you personally anymore. They only needed to consult a document. Decisions were no longer based on familiarity or circumstance. They were based on what was written. Appeals became harder. Context mattered less. This form of control was quiet, but relentless. A demand written down did not forget. It did not forgive. It waited. Records also preserved inequality. Obligations created in moments of weakness became permanent expectations. A bad year could define decades. What had once been temporary became structural. War's aftermath was frozen into administration. Memory worked alongside record. Communities remembered punishment even when records did not show it. Stories circulated quietly. A village fined heavily. A family displaced. A man imprisoned for refusing a demand. These memories reinforced obedience more effectively than any official order. You did not need to see punishment. You only needed to believe it could happen. Together, record and memory created a system that rarely needed to act. People complied in advance. They paid on time. They showed up when demanded. They avoided attention. Control worked because it shaped expectation. This system also narrowed imagination. When obligations are recorded and repeated, alternatives feel impossible. People stop asking whether something should exist and focus only on how to survive within it. Over time, this produced a population that appeared orderly, even cooperative. From above, society looked stable. Fields were worked, taxes were collected, laws were obeyed. But stability came at a cost that records never captured. Records cannot measure exhaustion. They cannot show anxiety. They cannot record the loss of possibility. And yet, these were the true consequences of post-war control. Written systems allowed power to extend far beyond the battlefield. War no longer needed to be remembered as violence. It lived on as structure, as expectation, as routine. This is why medieval wars reshaped societies long after the fighting ended. Control did not rely on constant force. It relied on permanence. And permanence was built through record, repetition, and memory. Once obligation was written, it became history's quiet enforcer. And once people learned to live according to what was written, resistance became not just dangerous, but unimaginable. But no system is perfect. Even the most stable structures leave traces of what they cost. To understand the full weight of medieval war's aftermath, we must look finally at what this long process left behind, not in records, but in people. Long after medieval wars ended, their effects remained embedded in everyday life, not as open wounds, but as habits, not as fear, but as expectation. The battlefield disappeared, but the shadow it cast stretched far into the future. For those who lived through the aftermath, war became something that was no longer spoken of directly. It was no longer an event to be remembered, but a condition to be endured. People adjusted their lives around its consequences without always naming them. They worked harder, spoke less, planned cautiously, endured quietly. This quiet endurance is what history often mistakes for peace. Peace in the medieval world rarely meant relief. It meant stability. And stability often meant accepting conditions shaped by violence that no longer needed to appear. Authority felt distant, impersonal, and permanent. The rules governing life were no longer debated. They were assumed. Generations grew up within these structures. Children born after the wars did not remember chaos. They remembered order. They did not experience conquest as loss. They experienced it as normality. What had once been imposed through force became defended through habit. This generational shift mattered more than any treaty. It meant that power no longer needed to justify itself through fear. It justified itself through continuity. "This is how things are," became the strongest argument of all. Over time, memory of alternatives faded. Stories of life before the war became distant and uncertain. People stopped measuring their lives against freedom or fairness. They measured them against survival and predictability. The question was no longer whether something was right, but whether it was avoidable. And most of the time, it was not. The long shadow of war reshaped relationships between people and authority. Power was no longer personal. It was systemic. You did not argue with it. You navigated it. You adapted to it. You learned where it allowed movement and where it did not. This adaptation created societies that appeared calm, disciplined, and orderly. But that order came at a cost that rarely appears in records. Creativity narrowed. Risk vanished. Ambition became dangerous. Stability replaced possibility. War had done more than destroy. It had reorganized life. This is why medieval history often feels distant and rigid when we read it today. not because people lacked imagination, but because imagination had been trained to survive within limits. Choices existed, but only within narrow boundaries shaped by the aftermath of violence. The most enduring outcome of medieval war was not territory gained or lost. It was the way people learned to live under pressure without constant force, the way obligation replaced threat, the way routine replaced terror. This transformation made violence nearly invisible. When something is everywhere, it stops being noticed. When pressure is constant, it stops feeling exceptional. Life continues. And because life continues, history often assumes that peace existed. But peace without choice is not peace. It is endurance. The medieval world was full of endurance. Endurance shaped by wars that officially ended, but never truly left. Wars that survived not in weapons but in systems, in expectations, in habits passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Understanding what happened after medieval wars ended forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most powerful consequences of war are not always found in its destruction. They are found in what replaces it. And what replaced medieval war was often something quieter, slower, and far more lasting. A world where violence no longer needed to appear, because it had already done its work.